Survivors come in all shapes and sizes, and this is small but very deadly. It also appeared in a very famous James Bond movie. We're going to find out more about it and its designer later in the show. Where's that flamethrower? Also in today's programme, I'll be taking centre stage for a rather unusual performance and discovering the secret of a well-made hat. But first, let's reminisce. Growing up in the 70s was pretty tough. And I'm not talking about football hooliganism, the three-day week, power cuts, the draconian pub opening hours, or fumbling about for a bit of change to call one of your mates from one of these. Yes, kids, there was a time before mobile phones. No, I'm talking to you about fashion. Who can forget cheesecloth, shirts with collars like that, tank tops, cap-sleeve T-shirts, and trousers that came up to here? If only I'd been born 10 years earlier. Back in the 60s, it was an entirely different sartorial story. This was the age of the mod.
Carnaby Street never imagined years ago it would be a fashion centre. It's the street where all the withered boys go for the expensive outfits the chicks dig. No matter how handsome a mod may be, the right gear gives him real class.
And the classiest item of clobber, worn by members of this sharp-dressed clan, was the three-button suit. And if you didn't fancy an off-the-peg number, you could always head down to your local tailor for a bespoke suit. But it's not so easy today. If you let your fingers do the walking through the current edition of the Yellow Pages, you'd be hard-pushed to find too many independent tailors. In fact, there's only that many. But back in the 1960s, you'd have had no such problem. And having a tailor to call your own meant automatic promotion to the Mod Premier League. Or should that be the old First Division? Threadneedleman George Dyer is one of a shrinking number of high street tailors keeping the old traditions alive. He's made a name for himself with his mod-inspired outfits and is about to embark on his most important assignment yet. The famous George, I presume?
Yes, that's me, Suggs. How are you?
Very well indeed, even though I'm up the Walworth Road for the first time in my life, I've got to say.
You're safe with me, don't worry.
OK, well, George, the reason I'm here is obvious. I want a suit made, mate, and I suppose you've seen the kind of things I wear. I like a nice kind of 60s three-button thing. Is that what you could do for me?
I could make that style for you, Suggs, but I'd like to show you my signature cut. There's a few special details on the slanted buttonholes, the shape of the lapels.
Well, the cut of the suit looks great, George. I'm no expert on these things, but I reckon we'll need some material. Crikey, this is no place for the indecisive. Oh, that's nice. The midnight blue. That's absolutely beautiful. Look, yeah, that looks good under a bright light as well. That,
you see the shimmering effects.
That's lovely.
The green's nice as well.
Yeah, yeah.
But
I think the blue's the man, George. Actually,
that's the one you want to go for.
Breathe in. It's time for the measurements. Waist 24 and a half.
Right, let's just go.
Chest 44 and a half.
Right.
Biceps enormous. When you get to the waist, try and keep it under your breath, George. Right?
No, I'll muffle that. Don't worry.
George cut his teeth in Fleet Street, where he was apprenticed to a firm called Dombey & Son. They're not around anymore, but they once boasted 38 shops in London alone, in the days when handmade suits were almost the uniform for the British Mail.
Just fell in love with clothes from an early age.
Armed with my rather impressive measurements, first George has to cut a paper pattern. He learned the tricks of the trade as a young apprentice, rubbing shoulders with tailors who started work in the 1930s. And now he's agreed to share his secrets with me.
Don't be frightened, just cut it out.
Go for it.
Go for it, yeah.
Cut it out, that's what my missus was telling me last night.
Just cut it out. You're doing it wrong.
What?
No, no.
Hey, back to my missus again.
That's what it's all about, enjoying what you're doing. You know?
Even if you are doing it wrong.
You know, enjoy it. Well, no, I've got you. Yeah.
So how come you do still enjoy it so much, George? I mean...
Well, every suit's different.
Yeah.
You know, everyone is...
and you still get the same satisfaction from seeing a customer bowling out of here looking like $1 million?
Well, what does it for me is the smile on their face.
Once the pattern's been marked out, it's time to get the scissors working on that rather natty fabric. I've seen how much this stuff costs per metre, so I'm not sure he should be handing them to me. It's a very satisfying process, actually. Now, is this going a bit... Where we've got the outside one, yeah?
The outside one.
You're going for that flared sleeve that you like, aren't you?
Well, just slightly. Now, you would have totally annihilated that if you should have stopped. But anyway, carry on. This is where we are. Oh, no, don't do that. It's got to fit you.
So, George, what does a two-piece suit start at here?
My base price for a two-piece suit would start at £650.
That sounds quite reasonable to me for a tailor.
Nice giveaway price.
Yeah, you'd be lucky to get 30 bob for it the way I'm cutting it. But hang on, I think I found a sideline. Just saying, the great thing is, you see, in my tailoring now, I've made myself a tie. See? Which is pretty remarkable, isn't it, from the first go?
Right.
Eh? Things start to get more complicated after this, so I think it's time to hand the scissors back to the expert and check out some of his handiwork. You can tell a lot about a gentleman by the lining of his suit. Now, for instance, here, City Joan, obviously dark and sober. Dark and sober. Hang on. Dark and sober. Oh! A little bit of flamboyancy. A man who enjoys his Friday and Saturday nights out. Dark and sober. Grey, dark and sober. Hold on. Whoa! Got to be a girl, though, isn't it? That's cheating. But now then, how's about this? Look at that! For your patriotic gentleman, you see? Goes to the bank like that. Gets down the pub in time for the football, and Bob is your uncle. Oh. Yeah. And I recognise the cut. It's a sports jacket. Oh, go on, you cheesy old fool. Anyway, no terrifically fancy linings for me, but it'll still take George a fair old time to put together a suit fit for Suggs. I'll be coming back later to pick it up. Whilst George gets his head down, I'm off to look for some headwear. Until the 1940s, almost everyone in Britain wore a hat, rain or shine. And almost all of them were made here in Luton, home of the hat trade. It began as a cottage industry with workers hand-stitching hats from home. Then machines got in on the act and small factories were tacked on behind the houses to accommodate them. By the beginning of the 20th century, business was booming, with over 500 manufacturers based in the town. And horses pulling crate loads of hats were an everyday sight on the streets of Luton. But then, around 60 years ago, the industry went into decline. Today, most of the factories have disappeared, while others have been put to another use. Only a handful of hat makers are still doing the business, and most of them import their goods from the Far East. But there is at least one old survivor which still makes hats in the traditional way. Walter Wright's. Philip Wright is the current boss of the company, which goes back 4 generations.
The business was set up in 1889 by my great-grandparents. Allegedly, the sweet story is that they got married at 11 o'clock in the morning, and at 2 o'clock they opened their doors to their first factory. It's the first custom-built hat factory. Unfortunately, in 1978, the factory, the main part of the factory was burnt down, and it's just left the outer perimeter wall. But we still have a little section which is now where the blocking and the machining and the cutting goes on, and the machinery that we managed to salvage from the fire. In its heyday, my great-grandmother employed apparently 1,000 people at this site. We employ 10, and it's just us.
But if Philip's great-grandparents stepped into the factory today, they'd notice that the method of hat making has barely changed, and neither has the machinery.
These machines were designed and built at a time when there was a huge hat industry. They work. If it ain't broke, we don't try and mend it.
These gas-heated blocking machines give the hats their shape. They arrived on the scene in the late 19th century, making it possible to mass-produce hats for the first time. At its peak, the factory used to turn out 12,000 hats a week, the same number it now makes in 3 years. And the minimum hat order you could place was 144. Today, it's just 1.
So now, by putting it through that process of the extra pressure, I've now got a really nice, smooth, perfectly formed brim.
This hat's a special order for one of Philip's regulars. The style's a classic, just like the sewing machine.
The machine she's using is probably about 80 years old. All the spare parts have to be made now by hand, and so it's as much skill of the machinist to not break the machine, because they're very difficult to repair.
No one can quite put their finger on what caused the hat-wearing craze to come to an end. but the increase in hairdressing salons and hair washing are thought to have played a part. But as far as Philip and I are concerned, if you want to stand out from the crowd, you can't top a hat.
For as long as people want to be different, for as long as people want to express an individuality and have a bit of drama about them, then there'll always be hatters.
I'm a pretty broad-minded chap, but I'm not sure Philip's creation will go with the suit I'm having made. The colours are wrong. And talking of my new suit, it's time for me to find out if George has finished the job.
Well, George, it's a work of art, mate.
Yep.
Lovely.
Well, I am the artist.
Well, I'll tell you what, I won't be needing this whole thing anymore, if you could dispose of that.
Gladly.
Hopefully see you again. Good luck.
It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, and for me.
Suave, sophisticated and unique. And what do you reckon to the suit? After the break, a trip to the theatre and a magnificent man in his flying machine.
They told me I was going to the theatre, so I've got myself all dressed up. But hold on, it's a church tower. It must be one of them fringe plays. And there don't seem to be many other theatre goers around.
Actually, it turns out it's not that sort of theatre at all. Instead, I'm visiting the oldest medical operating theatre in Europe. Built in 1822, in the days when the church here stood next to the old St Thomas's Hospital. The rest of the hospital buildings have long since disappeared, leaving the operating theatre as a rather unlikely survivor, stranded at the top of this church tower. They also neglected to tell me that I would be playing a part in today's show, a patient due for amputation. Luckily, I won't be sharing his doctor.
My designated surgeon for this operation is Karen. Hello, Karen.
Hello.
Did they mention my fear of needles?
No, but you'll be pleased to hear that we won't be using any needles.
Really?
Because there's no anaesthetic at all.
Not even any booze?
That's not good news, especially when you take a look at what was in the Georgian surgeon's toolbox. You could make some jolly nice furniture with that lot, but I wouldn't fancy it coming anywhere near me. And as if that wasn't bad enough, when this place first started, the whole grisly procedure unfolded in front of an audience. Trainee doctors like this dashing chap.
And what sort of people would have been operated on here?
They would be poor people of the hospital, poor people who basically would, come into the hospital because they had no other finance and they had no one to help them cut their leg off.
Whilst the rich could afford surgeons to operate on them in the privacy of their own homes, the poor had to put up with painful public performances before an audience of bloodthirsty students. Sounds like one of my gigs.
What would the atmosphere have been like in here?
It would be quite frenzied, really, because they would all be trying to see the this area here where the surgeon's sort of attending, and they would all be in the, hanging over the front, trying to see how to catch the artery there.
So what would have been the first part of the procedure back in the day?
They would take a tourniquet and put it onto your leg. This is obviously to stop the blood.
Once the tourniquet was fixed, it was time for the first cut. And with no anaesthetics to dull the pain, the surgeon couldn't afford to hang around.
You would be rushed in and pinned down very quickly. They would say, time me, are we ready? Are you ready? And then they would go down on the knee and then go through like that. Now, hopefully that's gone through.
Like cutting a joint of beef?
Yeah, and also, there's two bones in there, but the idea is to take a big saw and then take it through. You had to be quite good as a surgeon to balance the saw. And in the meantime, you're hanging on, sort of.
I was going to say, what sort of state of mind would the patient have been in at that?
Well, I think really that like Lord Nelson, he said about the coldness of the knife, and there's that shiver that he kind of almost intimated was a shiver. And then you've got this grind. So I thought I've always thought the grinding felt, to me, it makes me feel worse, so.
Certainly not making me feel better.
Yeah.
But that's not the end of it. Just when you thought it was safe to look, the toolbox is opened again.
Pliers?
Yes, and they're bone nippers, like cutters, bone cutters. And you can see what happens is that we tidy that up very quickly.
Trim up the jagged edges of the bone, yeah.
A box of sawdust was strategically placed to catch the blood, and tucked in the corner was a cupboard full of other medical paraphernalia. Once the leg was off, it was time to dress the wound.
But the trouble is that the infection, there was no bleach used. You know, there's no what we call hygienic, non-biological method, if you like, of cleaning. It's the great complaint of that era as well. Until 1865, this isn't going to happen. So you know that you're going to take a chance now, when you go away, that you may still get gangrene and wound fever, basically, is what we dread the most.
So it's just pot luck?
Well, not quite potluck. This room, higher up in the Tower of St Thomas's, was the herb garret, the 19th century equivalent of the chemist's lab, where all sorts of medicines were prepared from natural ingredients. If you were lucky enough to survive the operation, they might have helped nurse you back to health. Surprisingly, 80% of the operations that took place here had a happy ending, and I'm pleased to say mine is one of them, which means I'm hot-footing it back to the ward for a well-earned pick-me-up.
I can have a beer in there, can't I?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you deserve one for that.
The last operation took place here in 1862, after which this place was abandoned and boarded up. It was only rediscovered by chance in the 1950s. Today it's run by a trust, and you can pay it a visit if you like. But if I were you, I'd settle for a place in the stalls rather than centre stage. Now I'm off to meet a high-flying survivor. This is Ken Wallace, Wing Commander Wallace to you and me, bringing into land his most famous creation, the Wallace autogyro.
Wing Commander Wallace, this is a fascinating piece of machinery.
Well, the autogyro has the advantage that it can't stall as a fixed wing, and nor is it as complicated as a helicopter.
You might recognise this flighty little machine, because soon after this newsreel was filmed in the 1960s, she achieved international fame, starring alongside Sean Connery in the Bond movie You Only Live Twice. She was nicknamed Little Nellie, and today she's enjoying peaceful retirement at Ken's home, Ramerston Hall in North Norfolk. I've come to pay her a visit, but as I head for her hangar, I can't help noticing that she's not the only flying machine to have played a role in Ken's life.
So Ken, when did your interest of flying come from?
Oh, it's in my blood. My father and uncle, in May 1910, had completed what transpires to be the first steel tube aeroplane. That's my father and my uncle. May 1910.
Ken's dad and uncle were pioneering aviators, and he was keen to keep the family tradition going. Despite having partial sight in one eye, his ambition to join the RAF finally got the thumbs up from one of their top medics.
And I remember he said, Wallace, I'd rather have a man with a bit of fire in his belly who wants to fly than some of the perfect specimens I get who don't. He said, I'll prescribe for you a pair of flying goggles with a corrected lens for your bad eye. Don't have them on, but always have them with you. And if you get your good eye shot out on operations, put the goggles on and bring the aircraft home. I got in the Air Force.
And that is the spirit that put the great into Britain. Ken went on to fly hundreds of sorties for Bomber Command during World War II, and even survived a parachute escape from a crash landing in a Wellington bomber. Thankfully, he never needed his prescription goggles, although he still owns them today, just in case. But now, for the main event. It's time to say hello to little Nellie, who lives in this hangar at the back of the house.
Wow, Ken.
But hang on a minute, it looks like she's got some friends around.
And why so many, Ken?
Well, it's rather like having a harem. A lot of people say, well, what do you mean by that? And I say, well, they're all the same basic design, but they can't half differ a lot in their nature.
There are in fact 19 autogyros in here. Between them, they've transported Ken on missions for the armed services and the police. He was even roped in to help in the search for the elusive Lord Lucan. But I'm here to meet a movie star.
She's here, yes. Still a very fit girl.
Excellent.
There she is.
Look at that.
She's been around the world a bit and gathered a few logos.
For 60 years old, she must have had a bit of Botox.
This is Sean Connery sitting in the cockpit during the making of the movie. I reckon I'd look pretty good behind the controls too, but getting in may not be as easy as you'd think. Breathe in, 007.
Stand on the seat first, and then take your weight on the, put your hands down on the side. I'll just put the nose down, just your tip nose down, right. Okay. That's it. Right. And then if you take your weight on the side of the seat, you can get your legs down without pushing through the floor.
I see what you're saying.
Because it's not got a floor in it as such. You're getting there. You're nearly there.
What's most exciting to me is the little dials in here.
Yeah.
We've got the rocket packs, the aerial mines,
Yes,
the
you see.
flamethrowers. They're
Yes.
not primed, are they, at the moment?
Yeah.
Now, as a boy, Ken, I've got to say it's one of the most exciting action scenes of any movie I've seen, and you only live twice in this.
It was all real. Yeah, real flying.
But it wasn't real in the sense that it wasn't Sean Connery
No, it
flying.
wasn't Sean Connery. I was the chap who did all the flying.
So, Ken, how did the autogyro end up in a James Bond movie?
Well, it was entirely by chance. But the late Tony Skase, who used to do radio interviews, he came and interviewed me right here. And at the end of the interview, he said, "Would you like to have a fight with a helicopter with one of them, Ken?" And my answer was, "Give me half a chance." And that programme went out the next morning, apparently, on national radio. And Ken Adam, the art director for Eon Productions, the makers of the real James Bond films, was shaving when he heard me talking. And the next thing I knew, he got on the phone, "Ken, you've got to bring one of your gyro things down to Pinewood Studios to do with a Bond movie." I hadn't even seen a Bond film at the time, although I knew of them. I took it down to Pinewood Studios. I started the engine, and Hamish said afterwards it made a terrible noise echoing around all the buildings. And then he said, "You let the brakes off and disappeared in a cloud of dust, heading straight for the railway sleepers at the end of the piece of pathway." But he said, "When you came out of that cloud of dust going straight up in the blue sky, you were in the Bond movie."
No chance of that happening today, though. Little Nellie's flying days are well behind her, which is more than could be said of the redoubtable wing commander. It had been rainy and windy all day, and the purpose of our visit seemed doomed. Ken was never going to take off in that. But the first break in the clouds, and he was off like a packet of crackers. I'd never thought I'd see the day when I'd be chasing a 92-year-old World War II hero through his back garden, followed by a raggle-taggle camera crew. And before we'd even got into the open field, he was in the air. I'll tell you what, rather him than me, that up there is a real survivor.